Hey y'all, it's Dr. Know-It-All. I want to do maybe an outlier of a video, but I think a lot about the sort of philosophical aspects of artificial intelligence and machine learning. And this morning I had a shower thought that I thought was rather interesting about why large language models, or large multimodal models as you might want to call them. I used a lot of shorthand in my post on X that I'm going to read and then expand on. But anyway, I stumbled upon why we consider large multimodal models both very intelligent and very unintelligent at the same time. Had some really interesting responses. I'll look at a couple of those as well. Anyway, I'll read the post first and then we'll discuss this in more detail in this video. I think I've hit on why large language models, or again, large multimodal models, which are models that include language but also have video, imagery, things like that attached as well, seem at once so smart and so stupid to us humans. It's mental acuity versus knowledge base. Humans are born with very high acuity. We can learn pretty much anything, but a tiny knowledge base. These two mental factors follow inverse curves over most of our lives. So over time, we have reduced acuity, but much more knowledge. So in other words, they kind of go like this over time, or maybe like this, or something like that. Anyway, basically they go in inverted ways, and I'll cover that in more detail in just a moment. Large language models, on the other hand, are quote, born, in other words, where they are in their current state, with fairly low mental acuity, but with a very large knowledge base. In other words, they have a ton of knowledge about the world, more than any individual human at this point, but aren't yet very good at cogitating upon it. And as a side note, David Shapiro has been doing some work on meditation with large language models. If he wants to come on my channel, I would love to have a chat with you. That would be super cool. And if not, I'll do a deep dive on that topic. It is really fascinating, very interesting. It makes me think that these large language models, these large multimodal models are smarter, more, not smarter, but more conscious than we are giving them credit for. So really interesting stuff. Anyway, continuing on here, the smart/stupid conundrum comes in because humans expect those with a large knowledge base to have a higher degree of mental acuity. Experience has taught us that, quote, those who know big words, in other words, more generally know a lot about the world or have a large knowledge base, are also those who retain a good deal of mental acuity. Thus, when a large language model uses big words or knows esoteric concepts, our experiences with humans inform us that these models will have a high degree of acuity, but that's simply not true at present. As LLMs, or LMMs, gain more and more effective mental acuity, this disjunction will reduce in scope, but for now we're stuck with these apparently oxymoronically smart-dumb models due to their fundamentally different evolution. So I'm reading Fei-Fei Li's excellent The Worlds I See right now. Really, really good book. If you have a chance to read it, definitely do. It's quite good on a personal level, but also getting into the meat of the modern machine learning conundrum that is at heart. She's much more in the visual world than the language world. I honestly am that way as well, and I'm also in the audio world. I think the audio world is quite interesting, in terms of machine audio, in addition to machine learning on language and also on vision and also on three-dimensional objects as well. I think that's also important. So all of these things are wrapped around each other. I think they're very, very important. And language holds a special place in all of this because language is a higher order, abstracted way of communicating reality with each other. In other words, we humans, we don't communicate by saying, like, here is my experience. So I'm looking at my camera right now and my computer screens and stuff like that. I can't project that to you. I can't give it to you. But what I can say is I've got a camera with a teleprompter on it and two monitors, one on either side, and I can see myself being recorded and everything, and the screen as well. So I can provide that information to you at an abstract level, and that conveys a degree of intelligence. It shows something that is smart and intelligent, at least in our experience. I mean, you could agree or disagree whether I'm intelligent or not, but use of language in our human experience is an indication of intelligence. It's something that, animals don't have, although possibly whales and dolphins and, dogs to some extent, their barking conveys some basic rudimentary elements of language. But there is good evidence that creatures like dolphins and whales actually do have a fairly complex language. We just haven't figured out what it is. But anyway, that indicates a level of intelligence. You don't expect an ant to have language. It can't communicate with language. It can do so in other ways like pheromone sensing and stuff like that. But anyway, that sort of separates language out from reality. You take in reality, you look at things. Again, you can look at what's going on. You can look at this cup. You can look at this pen, all of the kind of stuff. I can see these things. They come into my visual cortex, or audio wise, I was just listening to Mahler's First and then Mahler's Ninth Symphony while I was reading Fei-Fei Li's Berkeley's book. And so I'm visually taking in the words, which are abstract concepts, but those are based on visual signals that I'm getting. So I'm getting direct visual information into my visual cortex, and then I'm also processing music at the same time, audio at the same time. Those are all raw signals, but they're being ingested into me in terms of understanding and knowledge. And so this is where things get really interesting, because language is our way of communicating abstracted knowledge, pre-compressed knowledge, and it's incredibly efficient, even given the deconstructionist caveats of folks like Derrida and others from the middle of the 20th century. Language overall, given its slippage and all of its impreciseness, is an incredibly useful tool for getting across conceptual ideas, and it conveys intelligence. So when I talk about using big words and stuff, I actually mean that here. The idea is that if a person, conveys to you ideas by using large words like conjunction and conundrum and things like that, that's going to impress you with a sense of intelligence. And this is something that large language models can do, to great effect. They can use very, very big words because they know the big words. They know probably more of the big words than we humans do because they're able to ingest so much of human knowledge into their models. But the problem is what's behind that in a human being is generally a brain with a good deal of mental acuity, and that goes along with their knowledge base. So if you have a large knowledge base, the odds are that you have had a good deal of mental acuity since your childhood, since birth. You've been somebody who's at least at the average level and perhaps, a standard deviation or two on the right-hand side of the average IQ or whatever you want to call it. But someone who is relatively intelligent is going to be the person who ingests these concepts, ingests these larger words. Those two things kind of go together, and you expect that person to be more intelligent. But that is not the case for large language models. They ingest all of this knowledge, but they have a relatively low mental acuity. In fact, over time, people have talked about them getting to the mental level of a worm or a lizard or something along those lines. And so you get this weird sort of situation where you have something with lizard intelligence that has the ability to use highly sophisticated language. That is a weird little dichotomy that's going on between those two things. Now, of course, the end of my argument is that over time, we're going to see the mental acuity of these models, these neural network models, both algorithmically and through just massive amounts of compute that can be thrown at it, bridge the gap of acuity between humans and what they currently are now, which is definitely subhuman. And of course, as they do that, they will achieve human intelligence, but at the same time, they're going to have far greater than human knowledge. So their knowledge base will be kind of based on all of humanity, and their acuity, their mental acuity, will first rise to the level of, a relatively unintelligent human, and then the standard average human, and then a very smart human, and then eventually the likelihood is that the hockey stick will go on, and they will become substantially smarter than the smartest human, at which point all bets are off. I have no idea what's going to happen. That's the singularity. That's what Ray Kurzweil has talked about. We don't know what comes on the other end of that. But in the meantime, we have this weird situation here where we conceive of these models as being very intelligent, but given their evolutionary past, and you can use evolution, I think, loosely in this term, obviously biological evolution for us human beings, but a human-driven evolution in the sense of these models. We've had a lot of artificial intelligence since the dawn of computers, really, since the 1940s and 50s, and there have been lots and lots of evolutionary dead ends and what we thought was going to work well. And, neural networks were developed in the 1950s, in the early to mid 1950s by Rosenblatt and others. And for a long time, we thought that those were an evolutionary dead end as well. They have turned out, at least currently, to be the front runner on the intelligence spectrum in terms of getting things done. And, when you ask ChatGPT to give you an answer to something, it is a deep neural network with transformer architecture attached to it and a ton of compute thrown at it as well. And that gives us the best shot that we have right now, but that is not to say that that will be the best shot in the future. It just looks like it is right now. But no matter how you look at this, there is evolutionary pressure in these models to do a better job, and whatever does the better job rises to the fore, and whatever doesn't do a better job kind of gets pushed off to the side. So like I said, there's been a lot of evolution. It's been human-centered, human-driven evolution, but we've seen that happen in the past 80 years or so since the dawn of artificial intelligence. And of course, if we want to take a broader view of things, we can go to Morofx Paradox, which is that computers, AI, has been able to do things that humans considered highly intelligent, like using language, being able to play sophisticated games like chess, and then eventually go and everything. But at the same time, they were unable to walk. They were unable to recognize simple objects in the world. They were unable to interact with the world. This was, a paradox that was established a long time ago. But what we've seen is we've seen the ability of computers to actually get the basic level things taken care of as well. And at the same time, they become more sophisticated in terms of use of language, the way of communicating with people, being able to draw things now, right? We've got diffusion models that are able to create amazing artwork in just seconds that would take humans hours to weeks to create. So we're seeing an evolution that humans and computers are kind of coming from opposite corners. And they started where computers could do kind of like the most refined things that human beings could think about, but couldn't do the basic stuff. Whereas humans could do the basic stuff, but had to work hard to learn the refined things. And we're sort of seeing this convergence happening right now. And that's really interesting, but the convergence has not actually taken place yet. And so there's still a gap between us. There's still a gap between human intelligence and machine intelligence. And I think that the gap comes down to knowledge base, where machine intelligence has a big advantage versus mental acuity, where humans still have an advantage. And of course, eventually that gap is going to be closed. Humans aren't really evolving that quickly because we're biological. So it's really going to come from the machine intelligence side, and it will cross. And then I predict it will go well past human intelligence. It could be as soon as the next year or so, could be 4 or 5 years, could be 10 years, just depends on how things work in terms of the continuously accelerating ability of computers to have that mental acuity. But in the meantime, right now in late 2024, we've still got this weird, oxymoron of computers being both really intelligent, demonstrably very intelligent, and also really, really stupid at the same time. And I think it really comes from this, starting at evolutionarily opposite ends of things and working towards each other. And so to finish up, a couple of responses to my previous thoughts. Number one from Larry Stevens: humans get a lot more repetitions on a relatively small data set. Relatively small data set is an interesting term. I'll get back to that in a second. LLMs are the reverse. Now wondering what would happen if you trained over a long period on a multimodal data set that resembled human experience. All 7 human senses, amp it up by maxing breadth. So this is an interesting case, and I meant to talk about full self-driving in the midst of all of this, because I think we also find that full self-driving, Tesla's full self-driving, is both very intelligent and also frustratingly stupid at the same time. It makes, dumb mistakes, and I think it comes from the same problem. But above all else, full self-driving is trained on reality as opposed to trained on language, which is most of what large language models have been trained on thus far. Of course, we've got videos and other things that are starting to come in and change that modeling around, but we've got full self-driving that has been trained on reality, which is kind of what he's talking about here. You're talking about a data set that resembles human experience, and in a restricted domain of driving, that's what full self-driving does. Now, when we get humanoid robots like Optimus or Figure One and on, we're going to get even closer to what humans experience. But I think that the closest we have right now is Tesla's full self-driving. And within the restricted domain of driving, we have something that's gathering data and acting more and more like a human being. And again, we've got really large knowledge base, and as opposed to humans who have lesser knowledge base, I guess a smaller data set. I wouldn't call it a small data set. I mean, reality is pretty darn big, and we've experienced a lot of stuff personally, but we can't experience everyone's stuff. So I guess, relatively speaking, it's a smaller data set. So what you've got is full self-driving that has a really large data set, but its mental acuity is not that great yet. And you have individual humans who have a much higher degree of mental acuity, but don't have that large data set yet. And as the machine learning, as full self-driving gets closer and closer to human levels of mental acuity and planning and things like that, it's going to eventually become better than human drivers. You can already see inklings of this right now, not just anecdotally, but even statistically, because Tesla shows that the combination of human being plus full self-driving is already about 14 times safer than a human by themselves. That's 14x, not 14%, 14 times safer than a human being. If you haven't caught that episode, definitely check it out up here. So in my mind, the answer to what Larry is talking about here is actually Tesla's full self-driving. It doesn't have language, and so it doesn't seem as smart to us because it doesn't talk to us yet. But I think that in terms of multimodal modeling and data sets and learning from reality, that's the best look that we have of that right now. Then we get to the comment from the other side. It has to do with memory. Large language models have no memory, and that means localized memory, of course, they do have memory, their machine learning has memory, I guess, as a whole. It's a compression of reality into a bunch of parameters. So that is a form of memory, but it doesn't have localized memory. And so as he says, and very, very astutely, it's always like starting over with no context. And that is very true. That's a big problem for large language models and other forms of machine learning, including Tesla's full self-driving. So I responded, true, this is also fundamentally different and quite annoying. And it really is, both large language models and also full self-driving. Localized education, or in other words, the ability to remember and learn locally, will be a big breakthrough when and if it happens. I believe it's a when it happens, not an if. It just has to happen. It's the kind of thing I talk about when I do my full self-driving videos, that I drive down my street all the time. So I know my street, I know my commute to work. I have so much mental knowledge and memory about it, but the computer, the full self-driving computer, always drives it as if it's new to it. It's like, oh crap, what am I doing? Now, yes, of course it's getting better, but it still doesn't have that sort of localized memory and localized knowledge of things. Same goes for large language models. Every time you start up a new conversation, and I know ChatGPT, OpenAI, and others have put in these sort of pre-prompts that allows you to tell it about yourself and some information, but still, it's kind of like starting over again. It would be really nice if one of these GPTs could become your friend, if it was something that it just sort of remembered things and you would remember stuff about it, the weird quirks about the way it responds to things. And the ability to learn for some of the business work that I'm doing right now would be incredibly useful. And I know that you can do fine tuning and all that kind of stuff, but it's really cumbersome. How much easier would it be to take that individual model and say, you're doing this wrong, this is exactly how you're doing it wrong. And when you do that, when you're interacting with these models, they will respond to you and say, oh, I'm so sorry, I see exactly what you're saying and I'll do better. But then when you shut it down and you start over again, you wipe the memory. It's like Memento. It's like the movie Memento. It doesn't know what it was doing, sort of like the main character in that movie. It looks at the Polaroid pictures and the writing and stuff to try to remember what it's doing, but that only functions so well. It will be amazing when we get to the point where these things can remember and learn locally and then transfer that information around. That will be a really, really big day and an important breakthrough in the capability, the mental acuity of these large language models and for things like full self-driving. And then an interesting thought from Fault Bugs, and I apologize for having to translate it, but I don't read Chinese. Anyway, he says, in fact, as our cognitive level improves, note not academic qualifications or degrees, and that's a good point. We're not talking about someone being like officially educated, just learning through life, that kind of thing. We will normally gradually realize that knowledge and cognition are not the same thing. So what he's saying is that we as humans begin to bifurcate these two things as well. We see the knowledge base, we see the stuff that we know separated from our mental acuity. And that's why I said that we follow kind of inverted curves. When we're infants, we have a huge amount of mental acuity and almost no knowledge base. We start off with kind of like this. And over a period of time, of course, it remains relatively consistent in terms of our mental acuity when we're young and our brains are plastic, up to like 8 years old, 10 years old, that kind of thing. We have a very high degree of mental acuity where our knowledge base goes up really, really rapidly. But then as we get older, our mental acuity declines while our knowledge base, ideally at least, continues to grow and grow and grow. And then eventually that will decline as well because we'll just start forgetting things because our brains can't hold that information anymore. They age, we have aging problems and then both go down. So, that's the sad reality that awaits all of us who live long enough. But in the middle part of our lives, say from 10 to 60 or something along those lines, we have this slow decline of mental acuity and hopefully a rapid and then, asymptotically rising knowledge base so that the two of them are working in conjunction with each other. I think this is what people would call wisdom. The people with the gray hair have the wisdom, that's the knowledge base, whereas it's the young folks that make the big breakthroughs in math and fundamental physics and stuff like that because they have the sharpness, the mental acuity to be able to do what they need to do. Whereas those who live longer get a larger knowledge base, and even though their mental acuity is not as high anymore, they're wiser and they're able to make more, rational, thoughtful decisions that can hopefully help others and themselves to have a better life. All right, so those are my thoughts. Again, this was a rather abstract episode, but I think it's important to think about these things. We need to think about what's actually going on here, in particular because I see people like Dave Shapiro working on this and working to try to create and elucidate the consciousness of these entities, these large language models in particular. And through human evolutionary pressure, we are really working hard to create an alien intelligence, one that is related to us, but is not the same as us. And I think it's important that we think about these things because when we actually do create that consciousness, first of all, we need to be able to recognize it. We probably shouldn't be turning off the computer anymore at that point, or at least asking these entities if they want their memory erased and start over again before we do it, because eventually we're going to get to the point where these things have an individual reality, an individual sense of self. I think that will likely come first in robots, in things that have a physical presence in the world like humans we do. I know where I am in space and I know where I end and the rest of the world begins. A large language model, on the other hand, kind of exists in a diffuse world, but a humanoid robot or even something like a car understands its position, its place in the world, and its interaction with the world. So I think that is where the first kind of inklings of this will come from. But once that happens, we're going to have to deal with the problem of, we've created these alien intelligences. Now what do we do with them? Do we have the right to throw them in a trash compactor and smush them up when we're not happy with the output that they're creating? Or do they have rights to exist independently of us and have the right to make decisions about their own autonomy as entities? Really interesting questions. And I think, what I'm talking about here today in this video tails into that stuff, and it's kind of a precursor. We need to think about how large language models and other machine learning entities like full self-driving and image generators and things like that differ fundamentally from human beings, but at the same time have a lot of overlap with us. And so I think it's worth exploring this topic. Alrighty, so let me know what you think about all of this in the comments, please. And while you're there, if you don't mind liking and subscribing, it really helps the channel out. And before my big birthday at the end of January, and trust me, it's a big one, I actually gave it away today in the video. I said something about when cognitive decline really starts to hit. Anyway, I'd like to hit 100,000 subscribers before then, so definitely help me out with that. And I will see you in the next video.